Hey guys, so today we're going to be going over what a joint is and the different types of joints. So a joint is where bones join, and this can be bone on bone, or bone and cartilage, or bone and teeth, which is a specific type of joint called kyphosis. And there's always space or connective tissue in between these bones, and this allows for movement of the joint. And I'm going to be using the word articulation a lot, and that's just the point of contact in that joint. So the function of joints is movement, and it's typically synovial joints, which I'll go over later. And the other function is facilitation of growth, and this occurs primarily in primary cartilaginous joints, which are called synchondrosis. We'll go over that later. And also in epiphyseal plates where there is no movement. And our skeletal system video in the anatomy playlist actually goes over these pretty well. It goes over the different types of bone, and I think that would be a great video to just get some context for it if you want to watch that first. So now joint classification schemes, and these are basically just how bones are classified. And they're classified with the joint structure, which is just the type of intervening soft tissue or connective tissue that keeps your bone together. Another classification is that the connective tissue that binds the bone is articular cartilage. We'll get into more of that later. And also the range of motion possible. So synarthrosis means that there is no movement. And an example of this are the sutures on your brain, or not on your brain, on your skull. Amphioarthrotic, which is slight movement, and an example is your tibia-fibia joint, or the radius ulna joint. And diarthrosis is it's freely movable, just like your shoulder. And essentially, the more movable a joint is, the less stable it is, and the less movable it is, the more stable it is. And we'll get to that a little later. So just an overview. So bones that are joined by solid masses of connective tissue. Now we're going to get into like the types of bones. So there's fibrous joints, and they connect bone that's bound by dense, irregular, or irregular connective tissue. An example is the sutures on your skull. And as you can see here, it's really dense tissue, so it cannot move. Another example is kyphosis, the teeth joint, and syndesmosis, which is more of like dense, irregular connective tissue, which is really in your radius and ulna joint. You also have cartilaginous joints, which are composed of hyaline cartilage, and this is where synchondrosis and symphysis come into play. So synchondrosis is your primary cartilaginous joint, and it is a temporary joint where your bone growth and growth plates are moving, and eventually they'll stop moving because you stop growing. And then symphysis is there for life, and it has a fibrocartilage disc in between the joint for strength, such as your intervertebral discs. So for example, this is a symphysis joint right here, because this is an intervertebral disc. And this is a synchondrosis joint, because this is like temporary cartilage for while you're growing. So yeah, so these are the types of bones that are joined by solid masses of connective tissue. So now we're going to go over synovial joints, and this is going to take the majority of our lesson. So basically, synovial joints have these structures. A synovial capsule, which is the connective tissue portion, a synovial cavity, which is the space between bones, and they have a really big role in motion, and your articular cartilage, which is essentially hyaline cartilage, a remnant of it, and it's also important in shock absorption. So this is just a diagram that you should get really familiar with, because it just shows where all of the parts of the synovial joint are, and I'll be going over these the parts of this now. So the articular capsule, which is like this bluish thing right here, it unites the bones, as you saw, and it encloses the synovial cavity. So this is the cavity, and it just kind of joins your bones and like is an outer layer for that. And this has two layers. So the outer layer is the fibrous layer, and it protects this articular capsule with the dense connective tissue. And then on the inside is the synovial membrane, which secretes synovial fluid, and this allows joints to move more freely, so you get a range of motion. And then you also have articular cartilage, which is on the actual ends of the bone. And this is hyaline cartilage, and it's not binding. So like, as you can see, it's not binding the bone together. And it also reduces friction between your bones so they don't wear down, and it absorbs shock so they don't fracture. And you also have your synovial cavity, which is that space, again, between the articulating bones, and it allows for that movement that your joints do have. So next, the synovial fluid is kind of just inside, and it's a thin film of fluid over surfaces with articular cartilage, and this really helps with reducing friction, absorbing shock. It contains phagocytic cells, which just basically kill anything that shouldn't be there, and it also supplies nutrients to your bones, so it's super important. And your articular discs are basically just fibrocartilage that divide your synovial cavity, and it's space for your different types of movement, so allows for like extension and flexion and different movements. So another structure is the meniscus, and it's an incomplete fibrocartilaginous disc, and that's located in shallower joints. And your labrum is a fibrocartilaginous lip to allow for a better fit between the bones in a ball and socket joint. The bursate is a sac-like structure, and it's similar to joint capsules, and it's only in certain bones. All of these are not in every single bone. It's just give and take for which bones really need the extra support. And then your ligaments bind bone to bone, as you can see here in the pink color. So next we're going to go over the types of synovial joints and examples. So the ball and socket joint, I'm pretty sure you guys have all heard of it, and it's the most freely movable joint. So usually there's a shallow socket and a bulbous head, just like your shoulder and hip joints. So, and they're also multi-axial, so you can move your arm like on multiple axes, right? So the thing is here, and I'll get into this later, one of these is stable and one of these is not stable. And then one of them can also move a lot more and one of them cannot. So just looking at like the curvature and the bulbosity of these, like the balls, and the depth of the sockets comes into play about stability of this joint. So now we have plane joints, and they're flat and they're biaxial. You can move them up, down, which is like anterior, posterior. And an example is your acromioclavicular joint, which is your shoulder joint, or not really your shoulder joint, it's like your collarbone joint right here. And see how it's just like flat? So that is a plane joint. A pivot joint, you can do pronation and supination. And all of these terms that I'm listing, we have a video about human anatomy terms that are super useful. It really describes what like pronation, supination, abduction, adduction, all of these are. So you guys should check that out. It's also in our anatomy playlist, and it gives some really good context. An example of a pivot joint is radio-ulnar joint, as you can see here. This is a pivot joint. So next we have the hinge joint, and they are uniaxial, so they can only go on one axis, either flexion or extension. And an example is your humeral-ulnar, which is your elbow joint, and your knee joint, right? They can only go like up or down. You cannot move your knee to the side. So that is how it's uniaxial hinge joint. Next, we have saddle joints, and basically like one bone looks like a saddle and the other one sits in it. And the movements that come with it are flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, circumduction. So you can like spin. When you think of your wrist, your carpometacarpal joint, that's your wrist joint, and you can really spin it. So that's where that circumduction comes into play from a saddle joint, and also your thumb. So your condylar joints are not deep or bulbous. Your metacarpophalangeal joint, which is your thumb joint, can also do circumduction. And here is an image of it. So all of those were types of synovial joints, and I just went over them really briefly. There's not much to them, but just good to know that they exist and like a few examples of each. So now, like I said, your hip joint has a really deep, like the acetabulum, like the part where it goes into it, like the socket of the ball and socket joint is really deep, and the femoral head fits like perfectly into it. So it's like a ball in a socket, right? So since it fits perfectly, there's a lot of stability in there. And since there is a lot of stability, it's not as movable, okay? And compared to that, your glenohumeral joint, which is your shoulder joint, the socket part of it, which sits, is really shallow, but your humerus is really deep, so it's not a perfect fit. So therefore, you can have a lot of movement. It's like putting a ball next to a wall. You can move it anywhere you want. So that's why your shoulder joint can move a lot more than your hip can, because it is less stable. So factors affecting the range of motion, they're measured in degrees. So obviously just check out the anatomy terms on the playlist. It really helps out with the stuff. So like I just mentioned, the structure, shape, or fit of the articulating bones can affect your motion. The tension of your ligaments can, and how well your muscles cover your joints also is important. Additionally, but not as common, are hormones. For example, during pregnancy, one of a hormone is released to relax the bone. Yeah, and also human growth hormones can affect your range of motion. So we already went over the study about the different types of motion, which is both stability and fit, are the most common factors that affect your range of motion. So that was a brief overview of joints and the types of joints and synovial joints. We went over that really quickly, but I really hope it was very informational. And again, the skeletal system video and anatomy terms are in our STEM Enrichment Youth YouTube anatomy playlist. Go ahead and check those out. They're super informational, give really good context. And this is about joints. Thank you.